Great piece. So I have a book right here, and it's called Medical Apartheid. And I think I've went over this before, but you know, it talks about schizophrenia in Detroit. It talks about schizophrenia in Detroit. Author named Harriet Washington. So I'm just like, you know, if you don't know like what were some of the modalities that were spread in certain intervals of history, like, one thing that I learned right when I was like 22, back then, right, I didn't know anything much about fruitarianism. You know what I mean? Like, you got a high metabolic rate and you're trying to be fruitarian. That's what I used to think, right? Like, just even vegan, not even fruitarian, but like, you're trying to just eat chickpeas and you got a high metabolic rate. And that's something that I did, right? So I couldn't imagine just eating fruit, you know what I mean? But like now I see like that's not really an issue, right? It was just, the air quality that was in 2010, 2009, it was different than it is right now. Like I can remember having cancer symptoms back then. And like now, right now, like I struggle with obesity, and I was talking to my health partner about this, and I said, yeah, like only time I got hospitalized for mental health was when I refused to take prescriptions, for mood enhancers. Like, why am I taking a prescription for mood enhancement? You know what I mean? Like, why? Like, why am I going to the doctor to talk to someone about feeling suicidal? Suicidal. Like, why am I going to the doctor talking about that? Why am I going to the doctor talking about like any of that stuff, like personal stuff, right? Because that's what they try to hit you with when you get there. They try to ask you questions that would incriminate you to either them building up a history on you, this person, he's a danger to the community. Like, and your parents, right? If you have like a mother or something like that who's, completely irresponsible with her health, right? She will get authorities involved if you don't want to take a drug that, she takes. Like, it gets to that point, right? You start to like report emotional abuse. You know what I mean? Like, and I had to do that. I had to report emotional abuse. Because I grew up in a household where, like, your mother drinks alcohol, smokes cigarettes, eat meat every day. Like, that's not normal. And like, you try to get the people involved at the courts who are railroading you, right? Because you have to go to a probate court, like, a county court, and they decide with their own independent experts if you could be your own guardian, say if you got hospitalized once or something like that. So it begins to be about the money that you're getting, right? And every time that I've got up into a point where I was trying to get my freedom. Like, you may have someone in your family that wants to take your money from you. This person, he can't handle his own money. You know what I mean? Like, and that happened to me once when I was with Social Security, when I was, working my job. But they took my money from me. You know what I mean? And so what I had to do is I had to contact the VA, and I ended up getting evaluated, and it was like, you can handle your own money. So not only did I get more money, but I was able to handle the more money that I was going to get, And like, I haven't made poor financial decisions since I've had my own money, like maintain my own house, made important investments. And this is the thing, right? When you're going into a court and you're trying to abolish, their criminal activities against you, like, they're going to do everything in their power. Because most of the people who you're going to see, they're not going to be they're going to discriminate against your national origin. Let's just put it that way. Like, they put a woman on my evaluation at the court who was like, the lady didn't even look like someone from my community. She didn't. You know what I mean? Like, and she wrote an evaluation basically saying, oh, a early story, he needs a guardian. I mean, like, and the evidence she gave wasn't even credible, right? Because, like, during the entire interview that I'm giving her, I'm basically like, calm, giving her all the information and more, right? Giving her all the information she needs to make that decision that will benefit me. And she didn't do it. Even the person at the outpatient facility who posed to be strong for that moment, you know what I'm saying, where he can give me enough resource to say, you know what, a early story, he can handle his own affairs, he don't need to be under guardianship. So, like, and that guy, right, he ended up leaving from my work case. He ended up leaving. My health case, he ended up leaving. And when he left, right, he didn't tell me he was leaving, any of that. Like, he didn't tell me anything, So, again, like, during that entire year, like, that entire 2 years that I was seeing him, he writing reports and me giving him the information he needs to make the right decision. His case study did not help me throughout the entire 2 years. So now it becomes a problem about misbudgeting. That's the Attorney General's problem to solve, So, like, if my mother, when she's at her age, right, and she dies, and she's still my guardian, right, what ends up happening is the courts have to step in and they have to decide what happens to me after that. That's unfair. That's not fair. They can conserve my guardianship, meaning they can give it to someone else. You know what I mean? Like, now I'm at the mercy of this person. You see what I mean? You don't want stuff like that happening. You don't want stuff like that happening. And this is why it's really no way getting around it, And, this is, I think, the only way to get around something like that, right, is you have to fund Democrats. If you don't want to fund Democrats, you have to fund independents. If you don't want to fund independents, you have to fund Republicans. You have to fund someone from the Democratic or Republican Party who is black. And, like, I think Jasmine Crockett, Garland Gilchrist, those are perfect people to fund, you know what I mean? Because they're honest about their cues, and the current politics and the current climate in the country. They're honest about it, right? Um, so that's what I mean. Like, that's what you want to do, right? And even like a person like Ilhan Omar, she would be perfect for that because she's a refugee, so she understands what it means to give a person their full package of rights. So like, you know, medical apartheid is, it's an excuse for groups to kind of take fact to the situation of, you have people who are highly emotional, like one case, right? Beating people, shooting people, that's not normal. Then what happens in a country is they start to say, we need mental health case studies. That's what I mean. And like my situation, right? None of my situations where, I had to go to a mental health facility was around being violent. It was about not wanting to take a drug that was prescribed to me. If you don't do what the state says or what the county says, they're going to come down on you. They're going to send cops out, Like one time a cop came out, right? And he got out the car, and I intentionally did this. I put on my scrubs to let them know, like, I'm a nurse. They came out, and you can see my shorts, my earliest shorts. You can see how they treated me when I was in the hospital. He came up to the porch, and he put his hand on his holster. And then he did that. He jumped at me. And I'm like, really? Really? So like, you gotta really understand something. We're at a climate right now where when you start to see things happening around you, it's time to do certain things. It's time to do certain things. You have to step out your comfort zone. You can't walk around to the stores anymore. You can't do that because it's police on patrol. You can't do that. One thing you have to do is you have to get your passport. That's what I did. You have to get citizenship in another country. That's what I did. That's what I did. So you notice when you have your passport, right, and it becomes a matter about immigration or land reforming, you always get treated with a certain level of dignity, even if you don't have a visa. If you just have a passport booklet and a passport card, you're in good hands. You're in good hands. And so like, I'm really thinking like, with all the political unrest in the country, with Juneteenth coming up, people are going to really be advocating for others to take social responsibility of what's happening in their communities. People are really going to get behind that, so you can see here, it goes a B. Yeah, so that B right there. That's why it's good, again, that's why it's good to eat weeds. And they don't tell you this in like, the doctors and stuff you see, they don't tell you to eat weeds. They don't, this is why culture is important. This is why culture is important. If you don't know your language, you don't know what foods you should eat, you don't know your national dish, you don't know any of this stuff as a result of being enslaved mentally, you're going to be in worse condition, and this is what I see with people in my family, right? it's no way you should be 70 years old, 270 pounds, you know, basically pointing out the flaws in other people or gossiping. You know, it's time out for that. Like, you know, it's really time out for that. You can't be that person. You know what I mean? Like, even when you, even even when you're doing,
like the police commissioner or city council.
Yeah. Even when you're like, you know, doing important things as far as like, well, this is what I'll do. I'll come back and do upload a second monologue. But again, this book right here, Medical Apartheid, you know, you want to get that book. Great peace, Yaakov.